On winter nights in the mountains, the world grows so quiet you can almost hear the past breathing. Snow drifts through the pines like falling memories, and the lake freezes into a silver mirror that reflects more than the sky above it. People say nothing truly surprising happens in a small town buried in winter, but they are wrong. One cold December night, a single flash of light tore through the storm, and a sound like distant thunder echoed across Timberfall Ridge. Only one man heard it, an old veteran sitting by his fire, who had every reason to stay inside and every reason to ignore the world outside his door. Yet, something in that sound pulled him from his chair and into the storm. What he found on the mountain road would change not only his life, but the life of a young officer and a loyal dog fighting to survive the night. Before we begin this journey, tell me where you are watching from. I would love to see your town in the comments. Snow wrapped itself around Timberfall Ridge, Colorado, the way an old quilt wraps around tired shoulders. By late December, the little mountain town seemed half erased under white, cabins hunched beneath heavy roofs, the main road reduced to a pale scar cut through drifts, the frozen lake at the edge of town lying still and dull beneath a low, iron sky. Wind slid down from the high ridgeline and threaded through tall pines, making them sway and whisper like an old congregation that remembered the hymn but not the words. Most porch lights had gone out early. Behind drawn curtains, stoves hummed, radios muttered familiar songs, and people decided that whatever waited in the dark could be dealt with in the morning. A little apart from the last mailbox and the last street lamp, a single cabin crouched near the lake. Its log walls were dark with years of storms and summers. Its roof sagged slightly under the weight of fresh snow, but the stone chimney still sent up a narrow ribbon of smoke, stubborn and straight into the restless sky. Inside, Elliot Granger sat in a wooden chair by the fireplace, with his hands open to the heat. He was 70 years old, and built like a man who had once carried too much weight too far and never really put it down. His frame was tall, still broad in the shoulders, but a small stoop had crept into his back, and his joints moved with the careful stiffness of someone who had learned to negotiate with his own body. The skin on his hands and forearms was brown and weathered, cross-hatched with pale scars, including one jagged line that ran from the base of his thumb along the inside of his wrist toward the elbow. A white reminder of hot metal in a war that now felt like it had belonged to another lifetime. His hair, once dark, had faded to silver and curled slightly around his ears and collar. He kept his beard short and neat, not because he especially cared how he looked for the trees and the lake, but because decades of discipline had left their habits in him. The only part of him that seemed untouched by age were his eyes, a clear, cold blue that had learned long ago to read danger and shadows, to measure distances, to listen for what other people chose not to hear. Those eyes had belonged first to a young infantryman on foreign soil, then to a father watching his boy grow up in these mountains. Now they belonged to an old man who had seen too much and trusted too little, yet who still got up each morning and split wood because the cabin needed heat and the body needed something to do. On the mantel above the fire stood a single-framed photograph. In it, a man in his early 30s wore a dark police uniform, the brimmed hat tucked neatly under one arm. He had Elliot's strong jawline and a more easygoing mouth, caught in a small, earnest smile that suggested he was slightly embarrassed to be posing. His brown hair was cut close, his hazel eyes bright and steady, as if he were the sort of person who listened more than he talked. The name engraved in small letters at the bottom of the frame read Evan Granger. Evan had been their only child, a boy who grew up running through these woods, scraping his knees on these rocks and insisting, sometime around 15, that you couldn't just complain about how the world was. You had to stand in the gap for people who needed help. He had chosen a badge instead of a rifle, believing that maybe he could fix something in the place that had raised him. 5 winters earlier, on a mountain road not so different from the one above this cabin, he had died in a drug bust turned wrong. His car had gone off an icy shoulder in the dark while chasing a truck loaded with poison meant for these same hills. The official report spoke of heroism, bad weather, and tragic timing. It did not mention the way Elliot had gone quiet for weeks, or the way Maggie had walked through the house like a person carrying something too heavy to set down. Maggie Granger now sat opposite him in a high-backed armchair, a basket of yarn at her feet. She was 68 and shorter than Elliot by almost a head, her figure softened by time, but still solid in a way that came from decades of work in diners, schools, and church kitchens. Her hands were small but strong, fingers moving with patient rhythm as knitting needles clicked, turning thick blue yarn into a scarf for someone who had offhandedly mentioned the cold. Her gray hair was twisted into a loose bun at the back of her head, stubborn strands escaping to brush her cheeks. Her face was lined at the corners of her eyes and mouth, the kind of lines carved by equal parts laughter and worry. Her eyes were a warm brown, normally gentle, but capable of hardening in an instant when she felt the need to hold someone, sometimes Elliot included, to account. Maggie had been born in Timberfall Ridge, the daughter of a logger who left before dawn and came home bone-tired, and a woman who could stretch a pot of stew to feed whoever showed up. Hard times didn't surprise her. She had met Elliot when he came back from war, raw and shuttered, the kind of young man who flinched at slamming doors and refused to talk about anything that mattered. Her instinct had been simple and stubborn. This one was not going to be left alone with his ghosts. She had been right more often than she had been wrong, and she had held on through years of marriage, the joy and fear of raising Evan, and then the bottomless, silent months after their son's funeral, where Elliot's grief tended to turn inward and harden into stone. Hers had tried to curl itself around him, refusing to let them sink separately. She had insisted on moving fully into this cabin when he began retreating out here, refusing to let it become a bunker he never left. If she could not heal what had been broken in him, she could at least keep a light burning and soup on the stove. Outside, wind pressed against the cabin's small windows, rattling the glass in their wooden frames. Snow hissed and whispered as it hit, then piled quietly along the sill. From deeper in the forest came the dull crack of a branch giving up under the weight of ice and snow, then silence again. To most people, that would have been just background noise, the honest breathing of a winter storm. To Elliot, every sound arrived with a label: wind, tree, plow far down the mountain. Nothing to worry about. His shoulders stayed relaxed. His breathing matched the slow rise and fall of the fire. Then a different sound came, and the air in the room seemed to tighten by a fraction. It was low and thick, a heavy impact carried through snow and frozen earth. Something large hitting hard, followed by a muted internal boom, as if metal had crumpled around something vital. The floor under Elliot's boots gave the faintest tremor. It was only a small difference in a world of winter noises, but to ears trained to pick out the one wrong note in a chorus, it rang out clear. His back straightened almost before the sound finished. Maggie saw it in the small, familiar shifts, the way his hand slid from the arm of the chair to his thigh, fingers curling, the way his eyes narrowed and seemed to look past the walls toward the mountain. "What is it?" she asked quietly, letting the needles fall still against her lap. "You hear something?" He listened for a second blow, a siren, the grind of a plow. Nothing came. The storm washed the world in its usual roar. "Up on the road," he said, voice low. "Something hit. Heavy. Close." "Could be a truck in a drift," Maggie suggested, though her tone said she didn't quite believe it. People always think they can outrun a storm with four-wheel drive and a prayer. "Maybe," Elliot said, but that didn't sound like getting stuck. It sounded like not stopping in time. He rose from the chair with a stiffness that pulled a soft groan from his knees and crossed to the door. The big metal flashlight hung from a nail beside it. His hand found the worn grip without looking. He reached for the heavy canvas parka on the hook, already seeing the slope up to the road in his mind, counting steps, remembering where the drifts liked to hide ditches. Maggie was quicker than his second arm. She moved to stand between him and the door, one small hand closing around his forearm. Her palm felt warm even through his sweater. "Elliot," she said, quiet but firm. "Look at me. It is blowing sideways out there. You are 70. Your left knee complains every time you climb the porch. If something happened, someone else can go." He held her gaze. When he spoke, there was no impatience in his voice, only a tired honesty sharpened by something older. "Who?" he asked. "The nearest patrol is in town or farther down the highway. That sound was maybe 10 minutes from this cabin, if that. You know how long it takes anyone else to get up here on a night like this?" She did. She also knew how long it had taken help to reach Evan. The memory lived in her like a bruise that never faded. "You cannot save every fool who decides to drive in a blizzard," she said, trying for sarcasm and almost getting there. You could barely save yourself the last time you slipped on the steps." A corner of his mouth twitched, the faintest ghost of humor. "I remember. You yelled at me louder than the paramedic did." Then his eyes drifted past her, to the mantel. For a moment, the firelight caught the glass over Evan's photograph and threw back a small square of reflection. Elliot saw his son at 18, standing in that same uniform for the first time, smiling too wide, talking about what it meant to be the one who answered calls when things went bad. He remembered the night years later when the call had been about Evan himself, the way the news anchor's calm voice had described a veteran officer lost in the line of duty, while the storm outside seemed to lean against the cabin walls. He had not been on the mountain that night. He had sat in this room and listened to the wind and told himself that whatever was happening up there was someone else's responsibility. "If I go and it's nothing," he said softly to the photograph as much as to Maggie, "then I come back cold and you get to say you were right until spring. If I stay and it's something, and tomorrow we hear somebody died up there while I was sitting by this fire." He didn't finish the thought. He didn't need to. The word again hung in the air without being spoken. Maggie's fingers tightened briefly on his arm, then loosened. She had spent her life choosing when to push him and when to stand beside him instead. This, she knew, was not a decision she could pull him back from without breaking something important inside him. "Then I will put water on," she said, her voice regaining that brisk, practical cadence that had seen them through every crisis from broken bones to funeral casseroles. "And I will find the big wool blankets, not the thin ones. If you find nothing, you turn around and come straight back so I can shout at you properly. If you find someone, you bring them here. The road into town is bad enough at noon." "Yes, ma'am," he answered. Gratitude and fear and something like relief flickered together in his eyes. He shrugged into the parka, its weight settling across his shoulders like an old pack, pulled a knit cap over his silver hair, and bent to jam his feet into thick winter boots by the door. The flashlight hung from his hand like another old-fashioned tool that could double as a weapon if it had to. Before he opened the door, Elliot turned once more to the mantel. Evan's young face looked back at him. Forever 32. Forever standing at the start of a watch he'd never finished. Elliot's throat tightened. "We're not sitting this one out," he murmured under his breath. Then he unlatched the door. Cold air slammed into the entryway at once, sharp and alive, pushing against his chest. Snow whirled in, a spray of white that melted as soon as it hit the warm floorboards. He stepped out onto the small porch and pulled the door closed firmly behind him. For a moment, he stood there, letting his eyes adjust. The cabin's light glowed softly behind curtained windows. Beyond its reach, the night was a shifting mix of darkness and falling snow. He clicked on the flashlight. Its beam cut a narrow tunnel through the storm, catching spinning flakes and the dark line of trees up the slope toward the road. The world shrank to the crunch of his boots, the rasp of his breath, and that thin, pale circle of certainty ahead of him. Each step sank deep. Snow swallowed his calves and tried to argue with his knees. He moved slower than he once would have, but he moved, counting his pace, angling toward where the sound had come from. Above him, unseen in the white dark, lay the curve of asphalt where metal had met ice only minutes before. Whether it held twisted wreckage and bleeding lives or just a dent in a snowbank, he did not yet know. What he knew, with the weight of an old promise settling into his bones, was simple. This time, if God had thrown trouble this close to his door, he would not be the man who waited for someone younger to answer it. Elliot Granger bowed his head into the wind and began to climb toward the road, into the storm, and toward the echo of that heavy, wrong sound, leaving behind the fire, the photograph, and the life that had taught him what it cost to do nothing. Snow swallowed Elliot's legs as he climbed the slope toward the mountain road. The wind howled as if trying to push him back toward the safety of the cabin, but the old man leaned forward, planting each step with grim determination. His breath fogged in thick bursts, turning to frost on the wool scarf Maggie had wrapped around his neck. The flashlight beam cut a narrow tunnel through the swirling night, and the storm seemed to resist even that small intrusion, closing around him the moment the beam moved on. Halfway up the incline, Elliot paused, bent slightly with hands braced on his thighs. His heart hammered. Not the panic of fear, but the stubborn, heavy thud of a man who had lived a lifetime longer than his younger self ever expected. He straightened and continued, muttering under his breath, Come on, old bones. Not tonight. Not when someone needs you. The road revealed itself as a pale ribbon beneath the storm. At first, Elliot saw nothing wrong, only snow, wind, and darkness. Then the light shifted, and the shape of metal broken against the embankment emerged like a wounded creature. A patrol car lay half on its side, nose buried deep in the drift, its emergency lights flickering in weak, dying pulses of red and blue. The windshield was a shattered web. Steam hissed from under the hood. Elliot moved faster than his body preferred, stumbling down the slope toward the wreck. His boots slid on ice, and once he nearly fell, catching himself on a jut of frozen earth. When he reached the car, he steadied himself against the doorframe and shone the flashlight inside. The driver was slumped over the wheel, Luke Henderson, a man who looked impossibly young in the cold glow of the flashlight. Late 30s at most, tall and lean, his face pale beneath smears of blood from a cut above his eyebrow. His hair, dark brown, slightly curly, was matted with snow and sweat. He wore the black winter uniform of the mountain patrol, the reflective stripe torn and hanging loose where metal had crushed inward. Even unconscious, Luke's expression held something steady, almost earnest, the face of a man who had tried to stay in control long after the world stopped listening. Elliot reached in through the broken window and pressed 2 fingers to Luke's neck. A pulse, thin but present. "You hold on," he muttered. "You hear me, kid? You hold on." A faint noise came from the back seat. A soft, pained whine. The flashlight swept across the interior. Wedged under the half-collapsed passenger seat, pinned by twisted metal, was a German shepherd, large and powerfully built. His coat a thick mix of black and tan dusted with ice. His ears were flattened in instinctive fear. Yet his eyes, warm, amber, and intelligent, remained alert even in pain. His breathing came in short, rapid bursts. The tag on his harness read simply, Ranger, K9 Unit, followed by a serial number. Ranger was about 5 years old, the prime of a working dog's life. Even wounded, he radiated discipline. Muscles held tense but not panicked, gaze fixed on Elliot with a mixture of warning and hope. A trained protector waiting for an order he couldn't give. "It's all right, boy," Elliot said softly. "We'll get you out." The old man reached into his parka for his phone. The black screen stared back, dead. No signal even if it had power. The storm had cut the mountain off again. He exhaled slowly through his teeth. The cabin felt impossibly far away now, though it was only a short climb down the hill. Maggie was right. No ambulance would reach them tonight, but he couldn't leave them here. Not in the snow, not the way Evan had been left, alone on a mountain road, with only the wind for company. Elliot backed away from the patrol car and took stock of the situation. The door was crushed inward. Brute force alone wouldn't open it. He needed tools, leverage, blankets, something to stop the bleeding. He swore quietly, then turned back up the slope, lungs burning. In the storm, his mind traveled its own harsh terrain, revisiting Evan's funeral, the silence in the house afterward, Maggie's soft voice calling him back from the edge. He had not saved his boy, but tonight he could still save someone else's. By the time he reached the cabin porch again, he was shaking from exertion and cold. Maggie was already at the door, face pale when she saw the snow crusting his jacket and the grim line of his mouth. "What happened?" she demanded. "Patrol car," he said, dragging in air. "1 officer, 1 dog, both alive for now." Maggie didn't waste a second. "What do you need?" "Crowbar, big blankets, first aid kit, the old lantern, and your hands later." She moved with surprising speed for her age, gathering everything as if the storm itself had whispered instructions to her. Elliot grabbed the crowbar from behind the woodpile. Maggie pressed a thermos of hot water into his hand. "You'll need this, and Elliot—" He stopped, knowing what she was asking without her saying it. "Be careful," she finished, voice trembling for only a breath before it steadied again. "I'll do what I can," he answered, which was all he could promise. He drove the old pickup truck, the one with a heater that rattled and headlights as dim as 2 candles, down the slope. The tires skidded, caught, skidded again, but Elliot managed, jaw clenched, hands steady on the wheel. The patrol car looked worse in the truck's beams. Elliot pulled over as close as he dared, grabbed the crowbar, and fought his way back to the wreck. Snow slapped against his cheeks with stinging force. He wedged the crowbar between the bent metal and the doorframe. Muscles that hadn't been tested in years pushed until his arms shook. The door groaned but didn't open. "Come on," he growled. "Don't you fail me now." He repositioned the crowbar, braced a boot against the car, and heaved. The metal shrieked, bent, then finally gave, opening just enough to reach inside. He leaned in and unclipped Luke's seatbelt. The younger man slumped forward into Elliot's arms. Dead weight. Too much for a man of 70. But Elliot didn't let go. Bit by bit, he dragged Luke out of the car and into the snow, lowering him onto one of the thick blankets he'd brought. Luke groaned faintly as his injured leg shifted. Elliot examined it quickly. No bone sticking out, thank God. Likely a bad break. Maybe torn ligaments. He splinted it with 2 pieces of wood from the truck bed, wrapping the leg with strips of cloth torn from a spare towel. Then Ranger whimpered again. Elliot turned. The dog's back leg was pinned under a bent seat bracket. The old man knelt, speaking softly. "I know, boy. I know this hurts, but I've got you." He slid the crowbar beneath the metal and pushed, not too fast, not too hard, just enough to lift the pressure. Ranger's powerful body tensed, ears twitching, but he didn't snap or flail, trained, disciplined, and brave to the last breath. Elliot grabbed a piece of blanket and offered it. "Bite if you need to." The dog gently closed his jaws around the fabric. With one final lift, the metal shifted, freeing Ranger's leg. The dog whimpered, licking at the injured paw, but managing to rise enough for Elliot to lift him. Ranger was heavy, around 80 pounds of muscle and loyalty, but Elliot carried him to the truck passenger seat, lowering him gently onto another blanket. Back at the rear of the truck, Elliot faced the hardest task, lifting Luke into the truck bed. Each attempt sent pain shooting through Elliot's spine, but eventually the officer was settled onto bags of sand, secured against the tailgate, covered with blankets to preserve heat. The drive back was a blur of wind and fear. Twice the truck nearly slid off the road. Once Elliot had to back down and take a different angle. When he finally pulled up to the cabin, Maggie flung open the door before he even honked. Inside, the cabin transformed into a battlefield clinic. Maggie brought towels warmed by the fire, bandages, hot broth. Elliot eased Luke onto the long couch while Maggie guided Ranger to lie near the fireplace. The dog's tail thumped weakly, loyal even in pain. Luke's eyes fluttered open once, unfocused. His voice was a faint rasp. "Ranger?" "He's here," Elliot murmured. "And you're alive, son. That's what matters." Maggie hovered over them with the firm gentleness of a woman who had spent a lifetime patching boys, her own and others, back together. "We just need to get you both through the night," she said softly. "That's all we ask of God tonight." Outside, the blizzard screamed through the pines, but inside the cabin, there were 3 people and 1 dog who were determined to fight back the storm. And for the first time in 5 years, Elliot felt the faint, painful stirrings of purpose. Morning came slowly to Timberfall Ridge, creeping over the mountains like a shy guest who wasn't entirely sure it was welcome. The blizzard had weakened sometime before dawn, leaving behind a muffled gray world of heavy sky and snow piled in soft ridges against the pines. Inside the Granger cabin, the storm's fury seemed like a distant memory. The air was warm, filled with the smell of burning pine wood, damp wool drying near the fire, and Maggie's tea simmering on the stove. The tiny space felt almost sacred in its stillness. But beneath that quiet ran a low electric hum, a sense that something had shifted in the night, and the consequences had not yet arrived. On the long couch near the fireplace lay Luke Henderson. His breathing was steadier than a few hours before, but each inhale carried a slight tremor of effort. His face, bruised and pale, twitched now and then, in response to pain he couldn't quite outrun, even in sleep. Maggie sat nearby on a cane chair, one hand resting on a towel-wrapped compress she had placed against his shoulder. She had not slept. Elliot could see it in the faint shadows under her eyes, but her posture hadn't softened. She had always been at her strongest when someone else was hurt. Ranger slept on a thick blanket beside the fire, his injured leg stretched awkwardly under Maggie's careful bandages, but his breathing remained calm, deep, trusting. Every so often his ears flicked at the sound of wind against the cabin walls, and he shifted closer to the warmth. His loyalty to his handler was so strong, it seemed to fill the space like another living presence. Elliot sat at the table sharpening a pocket knife. It wasn't that he needed a sharp blade. Old habits simply filled the tension better than sitting still. His eyes flicked often to the couch, checking for changes in Luke's breathing. He didn't say anything, but Maggie knew the signs. Under that quiet, a river of memories ran fast and dangerous. They both turned when Luke groaned softly and shifted. His eyelids fluttered once, twice. Then they opened fully, hazy with confusion and pain. For a moment he stared at the ceiling, as if unsure where the world had gone while he was unconscious. Maggie leaned forward. "Easy, sweetheart," she murmured, her voice warm enough to soften even the roughest winter morning. "You're safe. Don't try to sit up yet." Luke blinked, trying to focus. His gaze swept the room. The log walls, the little window glazed with frost, the fire, the blankets piled near his feet. Finally, his eyes landed on Elliot, tall, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, standing near the fireplace like a weathered statue brought to life. "Where am I?" Luke rasped. His voice was dry with sleep and cold. "My cabin," Elliot said. His tone was gruff but not unfriendly. "Timberfall Ridge. You took a little joyride off the road last night." Luke's brow creased as he tried to recall. The road. The lights. Something hit. Me and Ranger. He jerked forward at the thought, but pain shot through his ribs and he gasped. Maggie pushed gently on his shoulder. "It's all right. The dog is here. He's alive." As if understanding his name, Ranger lifted his head. He let out a soft rumble and dragged himself upright with effort, limping over to the side of the couch. He pressed his nose weakly against Luke's hand. Luke's face crumpled into a mixture of relief and fear. "Good boy," he whispered. I thought I lost you." Elliot approached, his heavy boots creaking faintly on the wood floor. "He's injured, but he'll mend. A tough one, that dog." Luke swallowed hard, nodding. After a moment, he lifted his gaze to Elliot, studying the older man, as if trying to understand why a stranger would drag two half-frozen bodies out of a wreck in the middle of a blizzard. "You saved us," Luke said slowly. Elliot shrugged. "Someone had to, and I was close." "Most people would have waited for morning," Luke said, his voice low but sincere. "Most people would have called it too dangerous." Elliot said nothing. Maggie answered instead. "Most people aren't married to my husband," she said, with a faint but fond sigh. "He goes where he's needed, even if he pretends not to." Elliot shot her a look. Maggie ignored it. Luke tried to push himself slightly upright. And this time, Elliot stepped forward, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Easy, your leg's in bad shape, and your shoulder's bruised clean through." Luke nodded again, letting himself sink back into the cushions. For a few breaths, the only sound was the fire popping softly. Then he murmured, almost as if the words slipped out before he could stop them. "It wasn't an accident." Elliot stilled. Maggie paused as well, compress in hand. Luke opened his eyes fully now, no longer foggy with pain. There was clarity, a sharp, haunted brightness that only men who had been hunted ever carried. "Someone planned it," he said. "Someone knew my route, knew what time I'd be on that ridge." Elliot folded his arms. "What were you doing out there?" "Following a truck," Luke said. "A white cargo truck. Paperwork said it was a logging supply vehicle, but every detail was wrong. We'd been tracking suspicious runs through the forest roads. Too consistent, too clean, too quiet." His jaw tightened. "I got too close. They hit me with floodlights from another vehicle and forced me off the road." Maggie's breath hitched. Elliot's eyes narrowed. "You're saying someone ambushed you? On purpose?" "Yes," Luke answered. "A group moving product through the forest. Dangerous people. They have sources, inside information." He hesitated, looking toward Ranger before speaking again. "Someone in our department is helping them, feeding them patrol routes, times, names." The weight of those words pressed into the small cabin like a new storm. Elliot's face changed, not dramatically, but in a way Maggie recognized immediately. It was the tightening of the jaw, the slight narrowing of the eyes, the faint flaring of old pain. "Inside information. Elliot repeated, as if testing the taste of it. Roots, names? Luke nodded, unaware that he had stepped onto a wound years deep. They knew I'd be alone on that road. They wanted me gone before I got too close to what they're hiding. Elliot's gaze drifted to the photograph of Evan still sitting on the mantel. The young man's smile, so familiar, so painfully bright, seemed to look back at them from across time. Luke noticed the direction of Elliot's eyes. Was he your son? Luke asked softly. The picture? Elliot's voice was quiet. Evan Granger, my boy. He was a police officer too? Luke's tone carried cautious understanding. He was, Elliot answered. His fingers closed slightly around the chair back, knuckles paling with pressure. Died 5 winters ago, a drug bust gone wrong. Luke watched him carefully. I remember hearing something about it. A crash, a pursuit in a storm, right? Maggie's eyes filled with shadows at that memory. Elliot didn't speak for several seconds. When he finally did, his voice was quieter than before, gentler in a way that carried far more force than any anger. They said it was an accident, Elliot said. Bad weather, bad timing. He lifted his eyes to Luke. But Evan was careful, smart. He didn't take stupid risks, and someone had told him there would be a transport run on that mountain that night. Luke's heartbeat seemed to slow as pieces slid into place. You think... I don't know what I think, Elliot said. But hearing you now, hearing about inside information, patrol routes, setups, he exhaled sharply, a sound like a long-closed door creaking open. It feels familiar. Too damn familiar. Maggie touched Elliot's arm. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She had lived inside that suspicion for years, even when they had no proof, only grief. Luke's brow furrowed deeply. Elliot, if there's a connection between what happened to me and what happened to your son, then this isn't just a busted patrol car in the snow, Elliot finished. No, Luke whispered, it's bigger. For a moment, none of them spoke. Ranger pressed his head against Luke's hand again, grounding the room with warm, patient loyalty. Outside, the wind brushed lightly against the cabin walls. The storm had softened, but something else, something older and sharper, had awakened inside these wooden walls. Elliot moved to sit across from Luke, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. Tell me everything, he said, from the beginning, every detail you remember. Luke gathered a breath that trembled slightly. If I tell you everything, he said quietly, we might open something. We can't close again. Elliot nodded once. Then let's open it. Maggie looked between the two men, one old, worn by grief, one young, bruised but standing on the edge of truth, and she understood, with a woman's instinct honed by half a century of storms, that whatever paths they had walked until now had begun to merge. A dead son, an ambushed officer, a wounded dog, a group in the mountains who thought winter would cover their tracks, and the past, which had refused to stay buried. Outside the window, a clump of snow slid from a branch and fell silently to the ground. Inside, the truth had begun to rise. 3 days after the blizzard loosened its grip on Timberfall Ridge, the mountains still held their winter silence. The sky lay low and heavy, pressing a muted gray light over the pines and frozen creek beds. Snow clung stubbornly to the branches, threatening to fall in thick sheets with every gust of wind. The roads were barely cleared, scraped thin by overworked plows that left tall walls of ice on both sides. The world felt softer, quieter, but beneath that quiet, something restless moved. The small mountain hospital perched on the foothill edge had never intended to house Luke Henderson for long. He was too restless to stay, and too determined to leave even before he could stand comfortably. The doctors warned him that his ribs needed more days of rest, his shoulder needed time, and his leg, though not broken, needed at least a week before uneven terrain. Luke listened politely, nodded, and then did the exact opposite. By the morning of the 4th day, he was signing his discharge papers with a stiff hand, thanking the nurse who'd changed his bandages, accepting a half-hearted scolding from the attending physician, and quietly arranging for someone to drive Ranger up the mountain to the Granger cabin. Ranger had made quicker progress, his back leg still wrapped in a supportive bandage, but his spirit unbroken. Every time Luke stood or even shifted, the dog's ears shot up, as if ready to move whether his body allowed it or not. When Ranger finally limped toward Luke in the hospital lobby, guided by a veterinary aide, he pressed his head into Luke's thigh with a fierce, trembling devotion. Luke crouched, slowly, carefully, and drew the dog into his arms. "Good boy," he whispered into the thick fur. "We're not done, not by a long shot." A few hours later, Luke's borrowed patrol truck crawled up the icy mountain road, engine rumbling, tires crunching through fresh patches of snow. The cabin appeared through the trees, seated humbly beside the lake, like an old sentinel who had weathered a lifetime of storms and still chose to stand guard. Ranger was the first to jump from the truck, landing awkwardly but determinedly trotting toward the porch. Before Luke could knock, the cabin door swung open, and Maggie appeared with her ever-present warmth and that firm, knowing gaze that made grown adults straighten their posture without realizing it. "I knew you'd be back," she said, as if she had been expecting him since dawn. "Men like you and Elliot don't leave things half-finished. Come in before you slip on something and undo all the hospital work." Luke smiled a little. "Yes, ma'am?" Inside, the cabin was alive with the smell of burning pine, a pot of stew simmering on the stove, and the faint herbal scent of Maggie's teas. Elliot was outside behind the cabin splitting logs, something he did with the precision of a man who had learned long ago that rhythm could quiet the mind. When he spotted Luke, stepping onto the back porch, he set the axe aside and wiped his gloves against his coat. "You're walking like someone stitched you together too quickly," Elliot said. "And you're splitting wood like you're 40, Luke shot back. A rare smile tugged at the corner of Elliot's mouth. "I'm not," he muttered, picking up another log. But before either could speak further, Ranger suddenly froze. His ears pricked sharply, his nose lifted to the cold air. Then, with a low growl vibrating through his chest, he began limping toward the tree line behind the cabin. Ranger didn't bark without reason, never had. Luke followed immediately, ignoring the twinge that shot through his ribs. Elliot glanced once toward Maggie through the kitchen window, then grabbed his coat and followed. The dog led them into a shallow path, half buried under fresh snow. It was a trail Elliot recognized faintly. He had walked it years earlier, back when his knees didn't argue with each hill. But this time, something was different. The snow had been disturbed. Luke crouched, wincing, running his gloved hand across the faint depressions. Tracks. Not the circular prints of boots, not the drag marks of animals. These lines were smooth, straight, parallel. "Tire tracks," he murmured. Elliot knelt beside him, sweeping away a thin layer of frost with the back of his hand. "These weren't here during the blizzard," he said. "Nobody uses this path anymore. It's a dead end." Luke examined the depth of the imprint. Not during the storm. Maybe the morning after. 2, maybe 3 days ago. Ranger's growl deepened. They followed the tracks deeper into the trees until they reached a clearing where an old lumber shed stood. Elliot had forgotten about the structure. It had belonged to a logging crew decades ago before the forest regulations tightened. The shed was weathered, its boards sun-bleached and warped, its roof bowed under years of mountain storms. It should have looked abandoned, but the lock hanging from the door was new, silver, untarnished, and recently installed. Luke and Elliot exchanged a glance, one that needed no words. "Someone's using this place," Luke whispered. "And not for storing lumber," Elliot muttered. Luke reached out, testing the new padlock. Solid. Industrial grade. Too new for a forgotten shed. Elliot didn't hesitate. Without a word, he took the crowbar he'd tucked beneath his coat, a habit he had picked up in the last few days, and wedged it under the lock's clasp. Metal groaned under pressure. With a final, violent snap, the lock gave way. Ranger stepped aside as Luke eased the door open. The smell hit them first. Chemical, potent, unmistakable once you knew it. A mix of fuel, fertilizer, and something more acrid. The smell of drug processing. Inside, the shed was no longer empty. Crates stacked against the walls were stamped with fake timber company logos. Several had burst open, revealing tightly wrapped bricks inside, plastic glistening under the dim light. "What in God's name?" Elliot breathed. But Luke wasn't looking at the crates. His gaze had locked onto the small makeshift table at the back of the shed. Papers lay scattered across it, held down by a rusted wrench. Luke reached for the top sheet. A map of the mountain roads. Red lines traced through forest paths, shortcuts and back routes Luke had never seen filed in any official database. A route circled in ink, a time, a badge number, his own. Another sheet caught Elliot's attention. He lifted it, brow tightening as he read the letterhead. Blaine Logging Co. It was a corporate form, one Elliot had seen years ago when Evan came home frustrated after a shift. Evan had mentioned the name, said something felt wrong about their trucks, that he had been assigned to shadow one of their routes but was called off last minute for a more urgent chase. A chase that led to his death. Elliot's fingers clenched around the paper until it nearly tore. Luke held up his own page, face ashen. "This is an internal patrol schedule," he said. "And this," he pointed at the circled notation, "is the exact time I was run off the road." Inside the shed, the cold felt sharper now, filled with the stale breath of secrets that had waited too long in the dark. "This proves someone inside the department is giving them access," Luke said quietly. "Someone with clearance." "And someone who likely did the same to Evan," Elliot replied, voice raw. Ranger's ears twitched. He began to growl again, low, warning. Luke straightened. "We should leave. Now. Someone will come back for this. And if they find us here, they'll assume we know everything," Elliot finished. The two men backed out of the shed. Ranger stepped protectively between them and the door. Once outside, they closed the shed just enough to hide the broken lock, leaving the snow to cover their footprints. As they turned back toward the cabin, Luke paused, looking once more at the forest, and at Elliot. "This wasn't an accident, Elliot. Not yours, not mine, not Evan's." Elliot looked at the snow-laden pines, his breath leaving him in a slow cloud. "No," he said. "It was a warning." They walked back through the trees with the weight of truth pressing against their shoulders, truth that smelled of chemicals, gasoline, and betrayal. Truth that had been hiding beneath the snow for far too long. Evening pressed itself over Timberfall Ridge long before the sun fully set. Winter had a way of shortening the day until it felt like nothing more than a brief, fragile candle between hours of darkness. Snow drifted from a heavy sky, falling in slow, steady curtains that muffled sound and blurred the edges of every tree and cabin. The forest looked peaceful, beautiful even, but Luke Henderson had never trusted quietness on a mountain. He had learned too quickly that true danger preferred still nights. The shed lay sealed again behind them, its secrets reburied under fresh snowfall. But neither Luke nor Elliot could unsee what had been inside. The crates, the roots, the timing, the papers with Luke's name, Evan's past. Everything pointed to a chain longer and deeper than either man first imagined. That afternoon, in the cramped cabin lit by a single lantern, Luke switched on the old satellite radio unit he always carried in his patrol truck. The signal flickered, sparked, then connected with static. Finally, a voice answered, a steady, clipped tone he recognized immediately. "Lieutenant Rhodes," Luke said. Angela Rhodes was a woman in her 40s, mixed black and white heritage, shoulders squared from years of carrying responsibility others avoided. She had sharp cheekbones softened by tired eyes, a short afro tucked beneath a winter cap, and the kind of calm that came only from seeing too much and refusing to bow under it. She was one of the few people Luke trusted completely. He explained everything in a low voice. The crash, the shed, the crates, the maps, the patrol schedule with his name marked in red. There was a silence on the other end of the line, not of disbelief, but of confirmation. "I suspected a leak," Rhodes said finally. "But this is bigger and closer." Luke's jaw tightened. "What do you want me to do?" "For now," Rhodes said carefully. "Nothing loud, nothing heroic. DEA needs time to petition the warrant, and we need concrete footage. Keep eyes on the shed. Record everything you can. Don't engage. Do not trust anyone from the department except me." Luke's gaze drifted toward Ranger, who lay near the fireplace, tail thumping whenever Luke's eyes met his. "Understood," Luke said. "Luke," Rhodes added more quietly, "be careful. Whoever set you up didn't hesitate." The radio clicked off. For a moment, Luke remained still, hand hovering over the device, listening to the faint hum of Maggie stirring something on the stove and Ranger shifting on his blanket. Elliot stood nearby with his coat already in hand. "You're going," Elliot said, not a question. "I need eyes on that shed," Luke replied. "And you'll have mine." Luke frowned. "Elliot, this isn't military action, it's surveillance, and you're—" "Old," Elliot finished. "Correct, but not useless." Before Luke could argue, Maggie stepped into the doorway of the kitchen. Her hands were dusted with flour. Her expression looked like someone who had survived enough winters to know when arguing with stubborn men was a waste of both breath and heat. "Take him," she said to Luke. "Better 2 sets of eyes than 1, and he'll only sneak after you if you say no." Elliot smirked, which Maggie ignored entirely. Ranger lifted his head, ears pricking. He tried to stand, but his leg wobbled. Luke knelt beside him. "Not today, buddy," Luke said, stroking between the dog's ears. "You need to heal. I can't have you running on ice like this." Ranger let out a soft, frustrated whine, pressing his head into Luke's palm. Luke stayed there a moment longer, feeling the warmth of the dog's trust, the quiet steadiness that grounded him more than he liked to admit. Elliot cleared his throat. "He'll guard Maggie and the cabin." Ranger's ears twitched, as if understanding the assignment. Night broke fully by the time Luke and Elliot reached the forest edge overlooking the frozen creek. They moved silently, Luke in the lead with a small handheld camera tucked into his coat, Elliot behind him with binoculars and his old hunting rifle slung over his shoulder, not loaded for violence, but as a warning shot if needed. The creek below lay like a long white scar across the forest floor, frozen solid under weeks of winter. Near the shed, a single yellow lantern glowed. Figures moved in and out of the doorway, tall, dark silhouettes outlined by the faint gold light. Elliot lifted the binoculars, his breath fogging in front of him. 3 men outside, he murmured. 1. Wait. His fingers tightened around the binoculars. Luke took the binoculars gently. Through the lenses he saw a man stepping out of the shed, a man thick in the shoulders, with a graying beard trimmed sharply along his jaw. His parka was expensive, too new for a mountain worker. His boots were spotless. Vernon Blaine, owner of Blaine Logging Co., friend to businessmen and politicians in nearby counties, suspected by a handful of officers, but never proven guilty. Now watching drug crates being loaded onto a truck. "Well," Luke whispered, "that answers that." He lifted the camera, zoomed in, and captured everything. The crates, the license plate, the faces partially lit in lantern glow. Elliot's voice was low, controlled. "He's the one Evan mentioned years back." I didn't want to believe it. Luke didn't get to answer. A beam of light sliced across the snow, clean, sharp, a flashlight. Someone on the opposite ridge was scanning the tree line. Luke and Elliot ducked instantly behind a fallen log, snow spraying up around them. Luke held his breath. Voices carried faintly. "Hey! Movement on the south ridge." Snow crackled as boots approached. Luke whispered, "We have to pull back." Elliot whispered back, "Slow and steady. Don't break the cover." But life did not offer them steady tonight. A gunshot cracked through the forest. Not warning, aimed. Bark exploded inches from Elliot's head. "Move!" Luke hissed. They sprinted through the trees, ducking branches, weaving between trunks slick with ice. The world shrank to flashes of light, breaths tearing at cold air, the sting of bark slapping exposed skin. Another bullet hissed by, burying itself into a mound of snow. Elliot stumbled, caught himself with a grunt, and kept moving. The men from the shed spread out behind them, their shouts echoing off frozen surfaces. "Don't let them get away!" Luke's shoulder burned with old pain. His ribs screamed. He forced himself forward, up the ridge, toward the cabin, toward Maggie. Suddenly, a shape burst out of the dark ahead. Luke froze. Ranger. The German shepherd limped toward them, breath steaming, fur bristling. Maggie must have tried to hold him back. His broken bandage flapped behind him, but he had run anyway, crossing ice and snow, drawn by instinct, loyalty stronger than pain. "Ranger, no," Luke whispered, but the dog was already beside him, teeth bared at the forest behind them. A figure lunged out from the side, a man with a gun raised. Ranger charged first, not gracefully, not cleanly, but with everything he had left. His body slammed into the man's arm, knocking the weapon aside. a shot fired harmlessly into the sky. Luke seized the moment. He kicked the attacker's knee out from under him, sending him tumbling into the snow. Elliot grabbed the gun and tossed it far into the darkness. Shouts grew louder behind them, and then sirens, high, sharp, splitting through the night like a blade of blue light. Lieutenant Rhodes had arrived, and she had brought backup. Red and blue lights refracted wildly across ice-covered branches. Engines roared. The men near the shed began shouting orders, scrambling to flee. Blaine's voice rang out briefly, furious, commanding, but it was swallowed quickly under the chaos. Luke clutched Ranger's scruff, Elliot bracing his shoulder. They ran up the incline toward the cabin as the first squad of officers stormed the woods behind them. Snow flew, lights flashed. Vernon Blaine's empire began to crack. At the cabin, Maggie threw open the door as soon as she saw the three figures emerging from darkness. Two men limping, one dog half collapsing at their feet. "Get in," she ordered. "All of you. You look like you survived a hurricane." Luke panted out, "Blaine's there. Rhodes is engaging." Maggie didn't blink. "Good. Sit. Ranger first." Luke sank into the nearest chair, Ranger pressing against his leg with a tired groan. Elliot collapsed onto the bench near the door. The storm outside was nothing now compared to the storm breaking open in the forest. Truth was no longer buried under snow, and the men who had hidden it were running out of places to hide. Winter loosened its hold on Timberfall Ridge slowly, almost reluctantly, as if the mountains themselves were unsure whether to surrender their white armor. For weeks after the confrontation at the frozen creek, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Patrol trucks came and went. DEA agents trudged through drifts with scanners and crates. Evidence bags filled, statements were filed. The shed, once almost invisible among the trees, became the epicenter of an investigation that stretched far beyond this small mountain town. And always, at the heart of things, were the recordings Luke had captured. Clear shots of Vernon Blaine under the lantern glow, crates of illegal product being loaded into trucks, maps outlining hidden forest routes, and the damning patrol schedule showing Luke's ambush time marked in bright, damning ink. It was enough, more than enough. Blaine had run, but he hadn't gotten far. He was arrested at a state line checkpoint, his expensive parka dusted with snow, his expression fixed in a stunned sort of disbelief, as if the mountains he had used for years had finally turned on him. The trial came quickly. The courthouse sat in the valley town below Timberfall Ridge, a modest building of brick and frosted windows that looked far too small to hold the scale of what had unfolded in the forests above it. Yet, on the day of the sentencing, people stood outside in clusters, breath clouding in the cold morning air, waiting to hear how justice would land on a man who had hidden poison in their hills. Inside the courtroom, Luke Henderson sat in the back row, posture straight despite the lingering stiffness in his ribs and leg. His uniform was crisp, hat tucked neatly under his arm. His face held a calm the months had shaped, a quiet strength that seemed newer, deeper. At his feet, Ranger lay with bandaged leg healed just enough to allow short walks. The German shepherd sat proud and alert, tail resting still against the floor, amber eyes watching every movement. A few rows away sat Elliot Granger. He wore the same old wool coat he always wore, the same steady expression, the same quiet presence of a man who had survived too much to be shaken by a courtroom. But in his hand, carefully folded, tucked close against his chest, was Evan's photograph. The picture had become smoother over the years, corners worn from handling, but Evan's smile hadn't changed. It stayed bright, hopeful, untouched by the weight of the world that would later try to crush it. The judge read the verdict aloud. Rackets of drug trafficking, attempted murder of a law enforcement officer, conspiracy, bribery, fraud, and obstruction. Each count landed like a stone dropped into a lake of silence. Finally, the sentence came. Life imprisonment, without parole. No cheers rang out, no applause. Justice in towns like this was never a celebration, only a release of breath people had held for far too long. Luke's eyes slid to Elliot. The old man did not smile. He simply inhaled deeply, closed his eyes for half a second, and nodded once, almost imperceptibly, a gesture of acceptance. of completion. When court adjourned and people filtered out into the brightening winter morning, Luke walked toward Elliot. The older man stood from the bench with the stiffness of old bones and old battles, Maggie appearing at his side like a shadow made of warmth and patience. Luke removed his hat. "If Evan were here," he said quietly, "I think he'd be proud of all this, of you." Elliot looked up at the sky, gray but showing the first hints of blue breaking behind thin clouds. "He doesn't need to hear the verdict," he said softly. "He already knows." Ranger nudged Elliot's hand with his nose, tail giving a soft thump, as though affirming something deeper than words. Maggie slipped her arm into Elliot's. "And you, Luke Henderson," she said gently, "you've given an old man something he didn't think he'd ever find again." Luke swallowed. "What's that?" "Peace," she answered simply. By late afternoon, the three of them were back at the cabin. Snow on the roof slid off in heavy sheets, revealing dark wood beneath. The lake was still frozen, but the ice had begun to lighten, taking on the faint shimmer that signaled the coming thaw. Luke helped Elliot carry firewood from the stack behind the house. The younger man moved slower than usual, but steadier than when he'd first arrived, half broken on that winter night. Elliot, for his part, moved more easily too, as if some hidden weight, had finally lifted. Inside, Maggie set the kettle on the stove, the cabin filled with warmth and the scent of pine. Ranger curled beside the hearth, letting the fire dry his fur after a short walk with Luke. Eventually, the three men settled on the porch, Luke, Elliot, and Ranger, watching the mountains fade into dusk. Pale gold light spilled over the treetops, catching on frosted branches and the surface of the frozen lake. "I spent years trying not to think about that night," Elliot said quietly. "The night Evan died." Luke kept his eyes on the view. "You don't owe me that story." "No," Elliot said, "but I owe it to him." Maggie stepped out with mugs of warm tea and handed one to each man before sitting quietly beside Elliot, her hand resting over his. "He left the cabin that night for the same reason you did," Elliot said. "Someone needed help. Someone was in danger. He heard the call and didn't hesitate." Luke nodded once. "Some people are made that way." Elliot glanced at him. "Yes, some people are." The old man's gaze softened. "And you, Luke, you could have run from all of this. You could have walked away, but you stayed, you fought, you listened. You did not let fear or anger steer you off the road." "Doesn't feel heroic," Luke murmured. "It never does," Elliot replied. Ranger shifted, laying his head on Luke's knee. Luke reached down, rubbing the dog's ear gently. "I think," Maggie said softly, "that if Evan could see you two right now, he'd be grateful, truly." Elliot looked at the horizon. "I think he'd tell us to stop sitting around thinking about him and get back to the business of living." Luke chuckled under his breath. "Sounds like a good man." "He was," Elliot said. "So are you." Silence returned to the porch, but it was a different silence now. Not the heavy kind filled with old grief, but a peaceful one, full of breath and warmth and something like healing. As the last light faded across the lake, Ranger lifted his head, ears perked, nose twitching at the cold air, guarding the three humans beside him as though the mountain's entire safety depended on his presence. Luke leaned back in his chair. Elliot rested a hand on Maggie's. Maggie watched the colors of dusk spread like a soft blessing over the ridge, and far above them, the mountains, older than any sorrow, older than any storm, stood steady, as if acknowledging the small, quiet victory earned this winter. The cabin no longer felt like a place where a man hid from the past. It felt like a place where three lives, once broken by different storms, had found their way back to the same patch of light. And somewhere deep inside that quietness, in the part of the heart that never forgets, Elliot Granger could almost hear Evan's voice, warm, proud, steady, as if carried by the wind. "You did it, Dad." The snow continued to melt. Spring waited patiently, and for the first time in a very long time, Elliot allowed himself to breathe freely. This story reminds us that God's miracles do not always arrive in bright flashes or mighty signs. Sometimes they come quietly through an old man who refuses to give up, through a loyal dog who keeps fighting, or through an officer who chooses courage even in the coldest night. And in our own lives, we face storms that no one else can see. Moments of doubt, days when hope feels thin, nights when we wonder if anyone hears our prayers. But God walks beside us in those moments. He guides our steps just as he guided Elliot on that snowy mountain road. He protects us in small ways we often notice only later. He sends strength when we feel empty and light when the world seems dark. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs encouragement today. Leave a comment to tell us your thoughts and remember to subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and love. May God bless you and your family with peace, protection, and strength wherever you are. And if you believe in the quiet miracles he sends, type Amen in the comments.